Hi everyone, it's Henry here, and in this video I'm going to go through how I've painted up the new lictor model that Games Workshop sent us through for review from the new Tyranid release. Now this is less of a traditional tutorial video that I often do for army painting or speed painting, where I try to come up with a load of sort of teaching points and try and make them as useful as possible, and it's more just me really enjoying painting up a model, wondering what I'd do if I was to do an army of them, and largely it's because my buddy Dan really wanted me to do a Hive Fleet Behemoth scheme. So let's paint. Over a black primer, I'm going to base coat the model using Vorbak Red. Now I'm going to use an airbrush for the first few stages of this. I'm going to keep the layers really thin so they blend together really easily without too much work, and I'm not paying huge amounts of attention to light sourcing and all the rest of it. We're kind of just going lighter from above, darker from below. Now I've thinned this paint about 2 drops of normal airbrush thinner, maybe 3 drops of thinner for every 1 drop of the Vorbak paint. I'm spraying at about 25 psi and I'm using a 0.4mm needle and nozzle, and the brush I'm using in this video is our Harder & Steenbeck Infinity. So once that Vorbak's dry, and you can see by keeping it quite thin, the paint, some of that black undercoat is showing through and already giving us areas of light and shadow. So let's continue this, and this is using Khorne Red. Now often when I paint red, I will do a white pre-shade, so a grayscale pre-shade, black through white, and then spray the red over it. But I wanted to go quite dark, quite, well, grimdark really, with this of a sort. And one way we can look at doing that is just building it up without that zenithal underneath it. That's not to say that you can't create wonderful grimdark models with a really strong grayscale underneath, but I want to go through why I had chosen not to do it on this model. So I've applied the Khorne Red exactly, basically from above, so anything that's sticking out and upward facing gets a good coat of the Khorne Red. And then the last red I'm going to go in with the airbrush is Mephiston Red. So these are all Games Workshop reds. There's a fairly big step between them, by which I mean Vorbak changes quite a lot to go to Khorne, which changes quite a lot to go to Mephiston. And this is just going to help sort of push that element of contrast to begin with, before we need to start going in with other things on the model. And actually one of the really lovely things about, I think, the Tyranid models is that there's so few elements to them that you can afford to really nail down what you're going to do for, say, the skin, the carapace, the tentacles, things like that. So a nice simple place to start from. And actually if you didn't have an airbrush, you could absolutely do this with a couple of rattle cans. For my first brush highlight, I'm going to go in with Mephiston Red again, and although I've applied that using the airbrush, and you can see it's a lot stronger on those areas like the shoulder or the upper limb and the tail, because I'm going to go in and apply it with a brush, it will actually give me more, opacity when I apply it with a brush, so it will show up more. And this is me getting completely confused with the order I've put these clips in, because I put 2 clips in and we spray them with Khorne Red. This right here is Mephiston Red, so ignore that previous Henry, he doesn't know what he's going on about. I'm applying the Mephiston Red to those upper areas that I've just been pointing out on screen. Should have been the clue for me really. You can see how that red changes quite a lot. So whilst the Khorne went more or less all over bar the shadows, I'm being a lot more selective where I'm putting the Mephiston Red. I've thinned them all about the same, so again 2 to 3 drops of thinner for every 1 drop of paint. They all airbrush very nicely, or they do for me at 25 psi. Then just to give the shadows a little bit more interest, and this is something I like to do when I'm doing most red schemes, is play around with the shadows rather than the highlights. I'm going to put some blue into the shadows, and for that I'm using Celestium Blue, which is a contrast paint, which means it's a really powerful blue paint. So I've thinned this down again, probably even more. Although it's an already thin paint, I want to dilute it further just so it's not quite as punchy. So I probably thin this about 3 or 4 drops of thinner for every drop of the blue contrast paint, and I basically turn the model upside down and spray it into the shadows, and this will give us this lovely sort of blue purple effect going on in the shadows. Now here I am actually applying Mephiston Red with my brush, and as I said before, even though it's the same colour paint, because we're applying it with our brush, we're going to apply it with greater opacity, so it's going to show up more, so we're able to highlight Mephiston Red with Mephiston Red effectively. And what I'm doing is I'm following all the various shapes that the sculptor has already put on this model for us. So I'm not having to think too hard. You can already see if you look at the model where we want to be picking out to do with our highlight. And this is just a case of relaxing because there's quite a lot of red on this model. But once you've got this done, you're well over halfway there. The skin, that is, not necessarily the Mephiston Red. I just wanted to take a second to say thank you ever so much for all of you that support us over on Patreon. At the moment, we've got a series Andy's doing on the new Cities of Sigmar Marshal, Free Guild Marshal. Absolutely incredible. I think this week's video is to do with painting the faces. I think he did 2. So there's 2 cracking skin recipes on there. And if you like sort of longer format multi-part series, that's what we tend to do over on YouTube, over on Patreon each week, as opposed to here on YouTube where it tends to be a different subject each week, perhaps with more of a focus on army painting. And you can see once that first layer of the Mephiston Red had dried, I'm going in and applying it again. Again, there was no rush with this model. It's still going to be army painting in my opinion because I want a really nice looking army, and it's not complicated. It's very relaxing, but you can see there the difference between the 2 arms, whether his right hasn't had anything, whereas his left there has had it. Now the consistency of the paint is quite important for doing this technique. So you can see it's really quite thin down. I've probably got 50-50 water to paint on my palette. And then I touch my brush off on a piece of kitchen paper so that I'm not flooding the model with paint when I touch it. But you can see just how much paint we're able to get off the end of that brush, even though it looks pretty dry. It's pretty thin paint, so we can do plenty before we need to go back to the palette. Now I got most of the way around the model and I noticed that I'd messed up a bit with the build and I'd left this big old gap on his face. Now if this was somewhere else on the model, I really wouldn't care if this was an army piece, even on a character model to be honest. If this sort of seam join was around the back, it wouldn't bother me at all, but it's smack on his face, so I ought to fix it. So I just took some isopropyl alcohol on a cotton bud, wipe the paint away, and then you use whatever you like to fill gaps. This is plastic putty by Vallejo. I often use plastic putty by AK. I sometimes use the old sprue goo mix of Tamiya plastic glue and spare sprue sort of melted down, just whatever you like. Now for the next highlight on the red, so we're now at our 4th highlight if you consider Galvorbak our base coat. I've mixed in a little Pro Acryl Tam Flesh to our Mephiston Red, and I've chosen that Tam Flesh because I wanted to go slightly more pink red rather than orange red. But if you wanted a Games Workshop equivalent, it's pretty close to Cadian, maybe a little more desaturated than Cadian is. And I'm going to go over the areas that I've already done with that brush highlight and just cover fewer of them, focusing mainly on the areas that I think would catch the light more. And this is also where we can start to determine where the viewer will look at first on the model. So for me, I think the arms are really cool, and I think the face is really cool on the lictor. Yes, his massive great scything talons are obviously a key part of the model, but the way this one's posed in particular, I think the face and the arms were the bits I wanted to stand out. So once I've been around the whole model and done that, I'm going to need to paint in the sort of fleshy bits between his carapace. No, his carapace is the shell on his back, isn't it? Well, basically these fleshy little bits near his joints, and I'm going to base coat them using Barak Nar Burgundy. I enjoy a fairly limited palette when it comes to painting, and Tyranids offer you that opportunity really easily. Now I've added in faded Ultramarine, which is another paint by Pro Acryl, but it's just a light, fairly desaturated blue. I've mixed that into the Barak Nar Burgundy to give me a highlight, and conveniently filmed it with the scything talon blocking most of that. But as I say, it's not exactly complicated, is it? We're just going to go in, just like we did with his skin, and highlight those areas up. So we've done exactly the same technique on the 2 parts of the model that are painted with regards to our brush highlighting, just mixing in a lighter colour to give us some highlights. And you notice around his face I actually added a little more Tam Flesh into that red and went one little step further. Now I wasn't very happy with how I'd painted in the purpley bits on his scything talons. They're a little bit messy. And when I think there's so few things on the model, and when you have parts of the model that are, whether you like it or not, focal points, you need to be a bit neater, I think. So I'm going back in here with Barak Nar Burgundy that I've added a little black into, and I'm just putting the recesses back in. Once I was done with that, it's time to move on to the carapace. So I'm just base coating this black. I've used AK black here, but you use whatever black paint that you like. And just take your time. I guess that's the key with all of this. You're not really doing very much, or I didn't do very much to paint this model. So I was able to relax and take my time and enjoy each stage. And I would consider each stage probably like a hobby session. To highlight it, I have mixed in dark grey blue, or blue grey, whatever it says down in the caption. Another Pro Acryl paint. This is a colour I really like actually, and is my favourite version of it currently available until we've got ours out. And this is where I'm going to start highlighting the black from. I don't want to go super blue like you see on most of the Behemoth schemes. That's just personal taste. But I did want a bit of blue in there rather than it being a sort of grey-black to highlight with. And for the ends of the talons, I've just sort of gone in and done little dashy scratches just to make them a tiny bit more interesting, rather than just highlighting the edges. But it's not a particularly strong highlight, and I didn't really want it to be. Oh, here we go, dark grey blue, there we are. And now I'm going in with just the pure dark grey blue and covering a slightly smaller area of those highlights, generally on the sharpest points, as it were, of the edges. And this is a back and forth thing. If you go too bright with it, or you make the highlight too big, just load up your previous colour and paint back over it and go again. You know, the paint we're using is nice and thin. It's roughly the same consistency the whole time that I showed you earlier with that red. And you know, for me, it's workable. Just making sure you touch your brush off on that paper so you haven't got too much on the end of it. Now for the eyes, normally I really like glossy black eyes on my Tyranids and my demon things. I think it looks wicked. But for this, I really fancied doing yellow. I think it's been done quite often, so I don't think it's particularly clever or anything, but it's just yeah, I think it's just a nice little flash of colour in there. And I use Japanese uniform there because it's a thick dark yellow paint. Something like Hobgrot Hide from Games Workshop is probably pretty close for that. Oh, sorry if you heard that. That's my dog coming in from sunbathing. It's very warm here this week in the UK, so it's been quite a challenge painting, so it's quite nice not to have something too complicated. And there we are. That you could absolutely leave the model at this point if you wanted to. It looks, and I don't want this to sound arrogant, I think it looks fantastic at this stage. I would love to be playing with this. I was really happy with how this had turned out. But for me, I like my models to be a little bit more grungy. So I'm just going to use a little bit of oil paint on here just to, in my opinion, liven up the carapace a bit. So I've gone for a red-brown colour. This is Bitume by Absalom 502, but you can see in the pot there sort of red-brown colour. I'm just going to make up an oil wash. So I'm adding a little bit of mineral spirits, mixing it up into a wash consistency. And I'm using a synthetic brush here because over time that mineral spirit will really ruin your natural hairbrushes. So either use an old natural hairbrush or use a synthetic hairbrush for this. Just make sure we really thoroughly mix it together. And then to test the consistency, I'll just grab a random sort of test model bit that I might have off to the side and just see how it's behaving when it hits the plastic. And what I'm looking for here really is that it's not too thin and sort of it's all separating out, but equally that it's also mixed enough so I'm not just getting blobs of almost the pure oil on there. And then I'm carefully going to apply this over the carapace, and I'm not just slopping it all over. I want it to slightly filter the carapace, to slightly tint the black, but also settle into the recesses and just give me that little bit of nice shading. You can almost see it here as it's even though it's wet, just a little bit of red in the shadows. I just think it's a bit more interesting. And that's an old natural hairbrush I've got there I'm using because it's got a nice point on it. Now I thought this model isn't for anything in particular. I wonder what NIDS would look like super glossy. And it's going to look terrible on camera because it's got loads of lights on it. It's going to be bouncing everywhere. But I thought, who knows, it doesn't really matter. Let's see, would this look cool on the table? And I think, yes, it would. Real sort of shiny bug vibe. But too much for me. Just a little bit too hard to look at. So I just used gloss varnish there. So now I'm going to knock it down. So here I'm going to use satin varnish. I like using the Ammo MIG Lucky varnishes. I find they're excellent through the airbrush. 25 psi, you basically don't need to be thinning them at all. And you just apply a layer, let it dry, apply a layer, let it dry. So this has had about 2 layers of satin. You can still see it's pretty damn glossy. I think I went a bit heavy with that gloss coat initially, to be honest. But yeah, too much for me. So bring it back down. Now I'll use Ammo MIG matte varnish. and see where we are at the end. And here we go. You can still see I've left some of that gloss in the shadows because the gloss will bring up the shadows more. And I really liked that purple blue I had in the shadows from that very early airbrush stage. But I've made sure to hit all those upward facing surfaces with the matte. So kind of pre-shaded, but with the varnish at the end. So I've got a nice little contrast of finish on the model as well. Areas that are really quite matte and then areas that are quite glossy. And I think again it's just a nice little touch which brings a bit more interest to the model. And here he is done. I've done the basing to match up against that model I did from Ben's Guard Army the other week, just for a bit of fun really, and I thought it'd be a nice thumbnail to do. I often say when I do these videos, I really fancy doing an army of these. I really, really fancy doing an army of these. I haven't had a model that I've done for YouTube that I've been as pleased with the outcome as I am with this for a long time, and it was very simple. I'm really quite surprised by the result from the simplicity of the paint job. But I don't think I've got time, which is a real shame. So if anybody really likes this scheme and is going to give it a go, please tag us in social media on it. I would absolutely love to see this across more models, across an army, because I genuinely think it's a lovely scheme. And it helps that I think this lictor model is absolutely one of the best models Games Workshop's ever done. So I hope you've enjoyed this little bit more rambly, a little bit more personal type of video. I still think there was hopefully some helpful points in there that you can apply to your own painting. So if you've got any questions about the video, pop them down in the comments. I'll do my best to get back to you as soon as I can. If you've enjoyed the video, hit that like and subscribe button. It really helps us out. And I'll see you next time. If you've liked any of the models in this video and you fancy having an army of them yourself, but perhaps you don't have the time or wherewithal to get it done, consider dropping us an email at commissions@cultofpaint.com and maybe Ben can sort you out.